Hi there, I'm Paul Traynor, and I'm grateful to be a participant in the Women in Cloud Digital Summit, as well as a sponsor this year through my company, Hey Moon Media. Today I want to talk to you about the most powerful motivating force in human history: fear. It's not something that we talk about very often, but it is hardwired into the human experience. So let's talk a bit about where it comes from, what it's tied to, and how every single one of us can become better at recognizing, neutralizing, and even harnessing fear in healthy and productive ways. By the end of this presentation, you'll have a better understanding of all of the ways that fear touches your everyday life, both personally and professionally. And I'll share my 3 favorite tips for dealing with it effectively to help you become more centered and connected. Sound fun? Well, give it a try anyway. So when leaders and visionaries are asked where their motivation comes from, or what inspires them, they almost never answer fear. And yet, it is a fundamental aspect of our lives. It's foundational to what it means to be human. We never talk about it because it's poor form. And when we feel pangs of anxiety, which is really just fear's modern, hip, younger sibling, too many of us deny it or treat it as if it's something negative or shameful. But anxiety impacts all of us every day. And for many of us, it can be crippling. It certainly was for me anyway. For years, the fear of failure, of exposure, of emptiness lurked inside of me. Sometimes it was right at the surface, sometimes it was buried deep. But early on, I discovered 2 fantastic secret weapons to help me feel connected and comfortable in my own skin: booze and pot. And they both worked until they didn't. And then fear just about swallowed me up. Today, I'm grateful to have more than 8 years of continuous sobriety under my belt. And the biggest revelation I've had in recovery is that fear undergirds every addiction or compulsion there is. A very wise man said that for alcoholics, fear was a corrosive thread that shot through all of our affairs. But the older I get, the more I realize it's not specific to alcoholics. It's at the root of being human. And whether big or small, annoying or debilitating, each of us has developed our own habits and addictive behaviors to deal with it. Now, there's plenty of evidence in psychology and philosophy to back this up, but my favorite explanation comes from Paul Tillich, the famous 20th century theologian and existential philosopher. His 1952 classic, The Courage to Be, has had a huge impact on modern psychotherapy. And when I discovered it, it was a real aha moment, where lots of disparate pieces just clicked into place for me. So here is my own paraphrasing of Tillich's central ideas. Now, there are 3 core fears that are intrinsic to the human experience. I call them the big 3. The fear of condemnation, the fear of meaninglessness, and undergirding all is the fear of death. Okay, goodbye, 80% of my viewing audience. I hope not. Anyway, for those of you who did stick around, I hope you did. Spoiler alert, this is a motivational talk, so there will be a happy ending, I promise. Right? So condemnation is a big fear because it speaks to our sense of worth, of thinking that we're a good or a bad person. And if I'm labeled a bad person or unworthy, then I fear I will be exiled or cast out. I will lose my community. Meaningless speaks to our sense of vitality, our personal spirit. Without meaning, we face a spiritual crisis. Now, we shy away from discussing spirituality in the corporate world with good reason, because too often it's associated with religion. But our spirit really refers to sense of self, to that which animates our body and soul. We are social animals, but we just can't feel part of something if there's nothing to be part of. If we lose meaning, we lose vitality. Now, the big kahuna of fears is the fear of death, and this is probably no surprise to you. But Tillich makes an important and interesting qualification. He says that our core fear of death is not about the physical act of dying, but rather it's the fear of non-being. The inevitability of death and the possibility of it arriving at any moment, however remote, means that simply being alive, being awake, takes real courage. The courage to be, to simply exist, is the effort required to embrace life as a human being with full knowledge of the inevitability of non-being. Hamlet grappled with this 400 years ago, to be or not to be. And we all remember it because it is such a perfect distillation of what it means to be human. Now, all of this begs the question, why the hell is this guy nattering on about such heavy, abstract thoughts? It's a fair question, granted, but it's important. it's precisely because these are abstractions that they're such a problem to us now. Think about it this way. One of the miracles of modern living is that most of us don't have to think of these core fears much at all. They're not part of our daily existence. We've successfully removed ourselves from the food chain, so we don't fear being killed on any given day. We live in a large and diverse enough society that none of us has to fear being cast into exile, even with cancel culture, because if one group condemns us, there's likely to be another that will celebrate us for the very same thing. Now sure, we all get the odd twinge of concern about the meaningless of life, but it's nothing that a Starbucks run or a new car or a 14-hour workday can't fix right up, am I right? Well, the trouble is, the big three are still in us, way down at the roots. We can't see them, but they send up little green shoots that emerge into the sunlight of our consciousness and grow bigger and stronger with just the right combination of bullshit and rain. And these little green shoots are anxieties. Anxieties sprouting from the unseen root of fear. They're weeds that keep growing because we can never get rid of the roots. And each root, each big fear, causes its own specific anxiety. And anxieties are perfect for the modern world, right? Because they're just little portable versions of the big three fears. So we can take them with us everywhere we go, like a cloud of gnats buzzing around our heads. They seem harmless, but sure is hard to shake them. And boy, are they annoying. So instead of lugging around, for instance, the big fear of condemnation, which is just way too cumbersome after all, we can grab onto its smaller anxiety, which is guilt. And we can take guilt everywhere, right? Guilt about what we did today, what we didn't do, what we ate, what we didn't eat, emails we didn't send, emails we did send. You know, most of the time it's stuff that we make up in our own heads. But this anxiety of guilt can be debilitating. So modern life has actually funneled our fear of condemnation into the anxiety of guilt. And many of us feel stuck with it because we have no idea where it comes from. Okay, so how about the big fear of meaninglessness? That the universe is a random black void and we're an accidental blip. That life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. That's a good one, right? That's Shakespeare. He had some serious issues, obviously. Well, thankfully, not many of us carry that one around either, meaninglessness. We'd never be able to leave the house, right? Much less hold a job. But thankfully, there is a handy portable version of meaninglessness, and that is the anxiety of emptiness, right? That little feeling of emptiness that can hit us almost anywhere. Usually it's vague, it's not too defined, but it's there. Things just aren't giving us the joy we expected. We've lost the oomph somehow. Nothing cataclysmic, we just feel a little bit empty. And that leaves us with a general air of malaise, which zaps us of energy. Okay, now back to the big kahuna. First among equals, the fear of death. Now this big fear is something that we spend most of our day detached from, completely, thankfully. But its little anxiety, its lesser variant, the snackable version, if you will, centers on fate. Now, fate writes its own narrative in each of our minds, which feels just as threatening to us as non-being. I'll never get that promotion. I'll never be able to retire. I'll be stuck doing X for the rest of my life. Now, the essential thing to remember is that these anxieties are not signs that you're broken, and they're not likely to go anywhere. They are intrinsic to being human, as natural to us as breathing or sleeping or our beating hearts. Because here's another secret I've learned. None of us control our feelings. Not our root feelings, down below the surface. But we all try to, which leads us to all sorts of negative behaviors like addiction, obsession, emotional distance, or greed. Then our feelings control us, especially when we can't see down to the root. Now, if you're experiencing high levels of sustained anxiety, it is essential to get professional help. And I've been there too. It is hard to ask for help, but it'll change your life. But how do we manage these low-level but real everyday anxieties that crop up at work or in relationships? Where's that helpful advice I promised at the beginning of this talk? Well, here are 3 reminders and practices that have been extremely helpful to me. When it comes to moral anxiety, where we feel that people are judging us, or even worse, condemning us, here's a little secret that changed my life. The global conspiracy against you has been called off due to lack of interest. You gotta think about that one. Now, the first time that I heard that, I about fell out of my chair. And I was laughing with instant recognition because most people aren't thinking about me at all, most of the time. And that's a good thing. If someone doesn't respond to an email or remember to meet me for lunch even, 99 times out of 100, it's because of what's going on with them and has nothing to do with me at all. So why do I take it so personally? Why does it feel like every slight I feel is the other person judging me, or that their inattention to me and my needs is somehow a personal referendum on how they view me as a person? Well, it's because I'm afraid. And I'm afraid because I'm hardwired to be afraid. And the fear of being judged or condemned is one of the biggest fears of all. So today I try to recognize this fear and remind myself that it's irrational. Because if someone forgets to return my stapler, it's probably not a moral judgment on my inherent worth. It's probably because they were thinking about something else. And it wasn't me. All right, what about the fear of meaninglessness and the anxiety of emptiness that I mentioned? The spiritual need to be part of that all of us has within. Well, I've got a great tip for that. And it's one that will serve you better and enrich your life more the more frequently you use it. Assume connection. Now think about the people you admire, either at work or socially, the leaders you've engaged with. They just assume that they belong in every discussion, right? And that it's worth having. And the people who do this are wonderful to be around, aren't they? Because usually they're the ones who make other folks feel welcome at parties or at work, who can make you feel like you belong. They assume connection. They behave as if the purpose they seek, the connection they want, already exists. And it brings others in, and it makes them want to be part of that person's connection too. By the way, there is a big difference between assuming connection and assuming familiarity. That is very important to note, okay? Connection isn't about familiarity or intensity. It's about purpose. It's about ascribing meaning to the people in your life and doing it in a way that is as broad, inclusive, and welcoming as possible. And it works for introverts just as well as the life of the party. Just practice reminding yourself that you already belong, you already have value, and that your participation in anything you do has meaning. It takes lots of practice, daily practice for me, but it always pays off. And finally, there's the big kahuna, the one you've all been waiting for: fate, death, non-being. So how do we possibly come to terms with that? And how can we recognize how much of an impact this fear and anxiety has on our everyday relationships and experiences? Well, there's a simple, but definitely not easy question that I like to ask myself whenever I feel threatened, or like I'm in danger of having something taken, or that I'm being ignored or marginalized. And it works equally well in professional settings and personal life. In any moment of stress or conflict, I try to ask myself, what other than my ego is at stake right now? And this is a big one. At least for me, it's huge, because in nearly every situation where the fear of anxiety wells up in me and forces me to make bad, shall we say, interpersonal choices, it is almost invariably the result not of any actual threat or risk, but rather the fear that I'm not being respected, that I'm being disconnected, that I'm being judged, or that I'm presented with something and given no choice. Now, I think that almost always, in the situations where I feel it is most imperative to assert my right to be seen, heard, obeyed, respected, it's nothing but my own ego flaring up to quell the hidden fear inside. Now, in some cases, there is something very real at stake, something important. And in those situations, I do have to respond. And taking the time to ask myself the question usually gives me a little space to work with, the ability to recenter so that I can act rather than react. But usually, very little is at stake. Not really. It's about me trying to tamp down something in myself that has nothing to do with the actual situation at hand. When I can see that, I have options, and I can take the most powerful step that I know. And that is, you ready for it? Surrender. This ability to surrender my desire to react, to take charge, to do something has changed my life. It's enabled me to not pick up a drink in 8 years, or to drive to my local dispensary because I'm anxious or bored. And so if my ego is the only thing that's at risk, then I'm not in any danger anyway, really, right? I can choose surrender, what some people might call ego death. If I want to remove myself from the feedback loop of fear and anxiety that's driving me to any sort of compulsive reaction, usually the best thing to do is nothing at all. And that act of surrender of letting go of my desire or compulsion, is the purest possible exertion of my own free will, because it's the only tool I have to take control back from the big fears of my subconscious. It takes lots of practice every day. But paradoxically, the more I practice surrendering, the more I feel like a winner. Thanks for your time.